Thank you all for coming. This is a almost record-breaking crowd. I don't think we've ever had quite this many people in here before. So nice job. Steam Cafe is a partnership with HayCamp and South Dakota Public Broadcasting. So we thank them for what they do for us. And we also thank you for attending. We could not continue to do this without you. We also have an online audience. So those of you who are attending online, if you have any questions at the end of the presentation, you will be able to ask them virtually. You can either type them in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I will ask them live and they'll get answered live. So stick around to the very end for the Q&A if you have any questions. So I'll turn it over to Hank.
All right, let's see if the technology works. We're good. Somewhere past the event horizon, way, way out there, the insanity of singularity compels one to ponder physics property we've been barely aware. Somewhere past, some stretch past the event horizon, some 13.8 billion light years gone. There's an end past all ends that becomes a new age dawn. Some nights I dream upon the void where space and time have cast me free. We've come so far, it's damn bizarre, but that's where you'll find me. Some way past the event horizon, black holes sing to me, and the dreams that I'm dreaming are dreams of astronomy. And the dream I'm dreaming are dreams of astronomy. Welcome to the Twilight Zone. I'm your host tonight. I'm Hank Fridell. These photos tell a story, and it's a story about my journey into the dark sky magic, amateur astronomy, and the history of the amateur astronomy community in the Black Hills. So I need to change this little gizmo out and get into my talk. Here we go. Here we are. Okay. About 5 years ago, when Marianne got me my tabletop telescope, let's see if I can find it. There we go. I ignored it. It's the kind of telescope you give your 13-year-old the year after you gave him the chemistry set. And it just sat there in the corner until I realized I could take my iPhone, put it up to the eyepiece there, and then snap a picture. I was hooked. I started looking around and discovered the Black Hills Astronomical Society online. Went to a meeting and then went out to one of their dark sky sites to do a little bit of observation. Richard Walker let me look through his eyepiece, standing on top of a ladder out in the middle of nowhere. And that's the picture I got. I believe it's the Trifid Nebula. I was hooked. Then, a couple months later, on the coldest morning of the year, there was a transit of Mercury across the sun. And that little black spot there was captured by my iPhone. I was really hooked. I didn't know which approach to amateur astronomy I should take. So I made a list. You see, I wanted to look up and be able to identify what I was seeing. I wanted to get a telescope, but would I look through the eyepiece or would I get a camera? You know, it's the basic decision right there. And I wasn't really sure. And if I got a camera, did I want to do long exposure astrophotography? That's a picture by Richard Walker. Richard, raise your hand. Richard has a monochrome camera, okay? And what he does with it, he puts it where the eyepiece should be, and he takes hours of pictures with different filters. They then stack all those images together, and you get something beautiful like that with lots of detail. How many hours were invested in that, Richard?
Typically runs about 12 hours of data.
12 hours a day. He's patient. Or you're going to want to do something like EAA. That's a picture that I took in 10 minutes using EAA. And the way that works, I have a video camera on where my eyepiece should go. I then feed it to a monitor. And that's called EAA, electronically assisted astronomy. And what you do with that is, if it's a computer that is the monitor, then there's software that allows you to capture that, stack it within 10 minutes. Bingo. Or maybe I wanted to use a cell phone to capture my images. That was a Comet Neowise taken out there by Jewel K. Okay. If you remember that one, it's a beautiful comet. Or maybe I want to be one of those people that does citizen science. You know, people that look for asteroids. Okay, we've got people in the Black Hills Astronomical Society that do that. In fact, some of our people have even discovered asteroids. Fortunately, we have the Black Hills Astronomical Society, because they could not only help me decide what I wanted to try out to do first, but they also provided guidance along the way. You see, amateur astronomy can be interesting and engaging, but it can be really frustrating. And if you don't have someone to talk you through those problems you're having, you're just going to get lost. I found that relying on product manuals and the internet just doesn't cut it, because they can't look at your rig and your situation. When 2020 hit, we all got locked down. And I thought what I might do is get my hands, it looked like I might have some time on my hands, so I corresponded with BHAS members and what kind of telescope I might buy, and I made a decision, bought a telescope and a camera. And I'd like to give a shout out to a guy who's stuck in Custer tonight because there's so much fog down there. Jim Grimes, he's an amateur astronomer down there too, and he's just been so patient. Also, Chris and Richard and the rest of the membership have really been encouraging and helped me along the way. The photographs you see here this evening are just the beginning, and they document my journey. But becoming an amateur astronomer took me on another journey that I really wasn't looking forward to taking. But it was a journey that introduced me to some amazing people and insight into what their journeys as amateurs was like. It all came about when I was checking out the BHAS website one day, and I found a page entitled History. It was a 25-page document about the beginning of Black Hills Astronomical Society in the 50s. I'm an old English major, and I really enjoyed that story. When I got to page 2, it ended with this sentence. Since Rapid City still does not have a, I knew it had, there's a lot of things Rapid City doesn't have, but it just didn't tell me. And so after talking to Chris, the treasurer, about the incomplete history, he says, well, you ought to talk to Ron. Ron Dyvig lives out there at Quinn, and he can tell you what happened. So I give Ron a call and learn that he's lost all of his notes from the history, as well as most of the things that he owned, when his observatory burned about 20 years earlier. We talked about it and decided to finish the history. We also recruited BHAS Observatory Director, Richard Walker, to help finish the document in early 2021. It is available as a free download from our website. Here are some of the stories I heard that when we were doing the research on the history of BHAS. You see, humans have always paid attention to the night sky. We're curious creatures. The sky impacts our daily lives with light, darkness, and many repetitious and unique events that can teach us much about the Earth, the universe, and ourselves. After all, the universe is our home. That's a picture taken at our observatory. It's out there by St. Martin's. And I don't know if you remember from 1997, the Hale-Bopp was a great comet. Looks like a Christmas card. Astronomy may not be the oldest profession, but it is the oldest science. The first documented records of systematic astronomical observations date back to around 1000 BC. But it wasn't until the 1600s that we figured out how to use glass and then mirrors to help us look closer at the night sky. The technology was difficult to master and expensive. So for several hundred years, it was not widespread and relegated to the wealthy and scientific communities. I think all amateur astronomers ought to wear outfits like that.
Where's yours?
Exactly. What a disappointment. Let's move forward to 1950. There was a movement going on in the United States that was fueled by do-it-yourself magazines and books, where the average handy person could do things for themselves in their home shops. People had tools, garages with workbenches, and they liked making things for themselves, even in Rapid City, South Dakota. In 1954, Jim Johnson of Rapid City read an article in Popular Science magazine on how to build a 200-power telescope for $30. He immediately sent away for an 8-inch mirror kit, becoming the first known amateur telescope maker in Rapid City. Excuse me just a minute. The first Excuse me, I lost my place. He immediately sent away for an 8-inch mirror kit, becoming the first known amateur telescope maker in Rapid City. Others followed suit, such as Byron Painter and Gary Crown, machinists at the state cement plant. As interest grew, more and more ads of articles fueling interest appeared. And that is a reflector telescope. And normally they have a tube. These are trying to make these a little lighter, so they just use pipe. But the light comes in up here on top, comes down to this bucket, and in the bucket is an 8-inch hand-ground mirror that these gentlemen, in this case, Gary Crown, made. And they make those by having two glass mirrors. And if I get this right, what they do is they put grit between them, and then they move the top mirror over the bottom mirror in certain ways, and it creates a dish on the bottom one and a dip, not a dip, and then a kind of a bump on the other one. And they can then grind those to make them perfectly astronomically correct, okay? And what happens is that light then shoots up to the top again, up to a 45-degree mirror, which then takes it out to the eyepiece. And there you've got it, you're looking at the moon, you're looking at Saturn. And that was a big thing back in the 50s. People couldn't afford to buy these 8-inch telescopes, and so they made their own, 30 bucks. In 1955, Bob Morgan and Reverend Irwin Erickson would drive up North Haynes Avenue, if you can imagine that, to a dark spot with a thermos full of coffee and look through Bob's 4-inch Criterion telescope that looked just like that. Bob remembered, we enjoyed searching for deep sky objects and planets, and of course the moon. We really enjoyed the moon. Why? It was big, easy to spot. The night has always made us wonder about what was beyond our reach. People like Bob and Reverend Erickson wondered what it was like on the moon. They thought there might be canals on Mars. They wondered about artificial satellites that one day might orbit the Earth. Manned space flight, that sounded like kind of a Buck Rogers kind of a deal. Just science fiction. But would it always be? And what about UFOs and aliens? We're still talking about them. Reverend Erickson heard about a new professor at the School of Mines, Dr. Russell Heckman. He had been a member of the Denver Astronomical Society, and as soon as the three of them were observing the night sky together. Bob said, during one session, we began to wonder if there were other people out there as crazy as we were, who'd want to stay up half the night looking at the stars. In 1956, an organizational meeting was held for the purpose of establishing the Rapid City Astronomical Society. 10 showed up to become charter members. Dr. Heckman took the reins of the organization and had big plans. The membership grew. Articles began to appear in the Rapid City Journal regularly. The article here notes that they're going to begin a class on elementary astronomy with a discussion about Mars, which was going to be coming by soon. They also mentioned that telescopes were going to be outside after the meeting. So people would show up at the meeting at the School of Mines, they'd take their telescopes out there to the parking lot, and then people from the community would come out. And those were really the first star parties that were held in Rapid City. It all happened there at the School of Mines. Dr. Heckman spearheaded a movement to build an observatory on the School of Mines campus. It got as far as having the state legislature provide land on the campus for the project. The article on the right notes that the project was going to cost about $6,000. By the time the article on the left was published, it was up to $10,000. As also noted, there was only one other observatory in the state, and that was in Vermilion. So I sense there was a little competition there, maybe with the School of Mines. But the Astronomical Society membership was skeptical that their off-campus group would have access to the observatory as much as they wanted, because they were afraid the school would take it over, and so the project died. Dr. Heckman had another idea. Let's build a planetarium. It was going to be here in Rapid City, receive big headlines. They formed a foundation to raise money, but they couldn't get anywhere near the $75,000 that was needed to build it. Things weren't quite progressing well until in '57, the Russians launched Sputnik. The world changed. When Russia launched Sputnik, the USA faced a new technological challenge that had never been seen before. Even the Rapid City Astronomical Society responded by organizing a 9-member satellite patrol with a battery of binoculars, 2 telescopes, and a shortwave radio to hear Sputnik's beeps and try to spot the satellite. I never found out if they were able to spot it. The article also referred to Sputnik as an artificial moon. It was a hot topic at the Astronomical Society meetings. Now, Sputnik, I think it was 22 inches in diameter. I'm guessing he'd be a pretty lucky spot if they would have been able to see it. But the newspaper articles were all about the fear that this 22-inch sphere was going to drop a bomb on the US. When the Russians launched the satellite, the United States suddenly decided they needed to lead the world in space science and technology. The results were dramatic. The space race was on, NASA was founded. Congress established Title I, a program that funded efforts to raise student math and reading scores for this new age of technology. Computers were developed. It heated up the arms race. In 12 years, we landed on the moon. It was a small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind. You remember. Interest was high in astronomy. People were joining the organization. The association had momentum and they were looking to build an observatory. So during this period, they acquired the use of land from the St. Martin's area, from the St. Martin's group, and its members built a observatory and a high-powered telescope. Here on the left, the mayor is over there on the left with a trowel in his hand for the photo op. And Ron Dyvig was telling people that we certainly wouldn't turn down any donations. Most of the building materials, as I understand it, were donated, except for the dome. The dome was built by a commercial fabricator downtown, and it was the biggest expense for the project. It was an exciting time for amateur astronomers in Rapid City. The telescope seen inside the dome was built by our club members, Gary Crown and Byron Painter, the machinists from the state cement plant, constructed the mount. And in fact, they even got permission from the state cement plant to use the machine works, the lathes and all that stuff to create the mount. And Ron Dyvig, who's here this evening, hand ground the 12.5-inch mirror. It's a pretty good sized mirror to be grinding. We now refer to that as telescope as HVO1. The Hidden Valley Observatory was completed in 1965, and it was the pride of the membership. It was a dream come true. But a few years later, the observatory building was vandalized. The 12.5-inch mirror was destroyed, eyepieces were stolen, and the building was trashed. The membership were devastated. They still owed money on the steel dome, and they had what seemed like nothing after so much work. In the late 1960s then, some high school students from Rapid City got interested in the club. They started to talk about doing some fundraisers to pay off the debt and install a new telescope. One of these students, Kent Stevens, was elected president of the association. They began to re-energize the club and put it on public star parties. And they began to develop plans for the new telescope. In 1970, the high school students helped organize a solar eclipse party. Kent Stevens' mother took videos of the event, and Kent recently shared that. And if I can get it to work, I'd like to show you the video. It's a real piece of work. How do I get this thing to work? Let's try that. Who's my tech person here? There's a, see the arrow down there? There, it's working. Okay. Okay, there's the observatory. Dave Cooper, Barry Wick, and Ken Stevens were the high school students that were really the driving force behind the association there. There's our St. Martin's Academy. You can see they've got some telescopes set up. They didn't have filters at that time for their telescopes. What they did is they put a piece of cardboard in front of it, poked a little hole, and then they projected it on it to a piece of paper. Great cars, you know, let's look at the cars. This is over 50 years ago. There you can see the eclipse starting to come up. There's one piece I want to show you here. There's the cardboard. Now they have an oscilloscope connected to a photometer on that 3-inch telescope that Kent constructed. So these high school kids were like on fire. They took over the organization. Had a chance to correspond with Barry Wick. And in our history, he had a little section that he wrote about. There it is there, it's the photometer on there. Hooked up to the oscilloscope. And these guys kind of ham it up, you know, high school students. Great car. In 1971, the new telescope, dubbed HVO2, was installed. Their debts were paid and the organization was back on its feet, all thanks to high school students. I thought that was great. HVO2 telescope was designed by high school student Ken Stevens, and it was the observatory telescope for 45 years until 2016, when it was replaced by a grant from the South Dakota Space Grant Consortium. And it's pictured it right there. It's a Meade LX200. This telescope was dubbed HVO3. We soon discovered problems, though, with the HVO3 telescope mount and spent 7 years developing workarounds to make it work. But it was never dependable enough to reliably use at star parties. This fall, however, Black Hills Astronomical Society membership decided to replace the problematic mount and bring its astrophotography capabilities up to speed. And we found out that we were just awarded a grant from the South Dakota Space Grant Consortium. Thank you very much. And we are expecting that by the summer of 2023, when you come out for star parties, it's going to be in place. And we've begun work on it already, and it appears to look like it is a observatory grade telescope. It is going to be fully set up with cameras, with rotators, with filter wheels, the whole deal. And we're really excited. As I helped put together the Astronomical Society history, from that first meeting in 1956 to this day, there were a couple of important things that I learned about the club that have been true for nearly 70 years. First, the membership have been people who have liked to fiddle with things. They like to build things, they like to figure things out, and most important, they like to share what they know. The club would invite the public to their events every summer to look through telescope eyepieces and be amazed at what they saw. Public informational meetings have also been held during the winter. Today, not only can you still look through these eyepieces at the star parties, but you can see projections on monitors of deep sky objects that visual astronomers cannot see. Club members gather at dark sky sites regularly to share their passion for viewing the night sky with one another. We've got several sites out to the east and to the south, and if you live down by Custer, we've got a spot down just north of Jewel Cave. There's nothing like getting out to where you can see the horizon and the Milky Way just comes beaming through. And finally, events of the day that we have no control over often drive interest in the club. Sputnik, Halley's Comet, solar eclipses, the moon landing, the pandemic all seem to spark interest and increase our membership. And we just have to take advantage of them when they show up. This is on our website where you go to see to get the history. It's a download, okay? And it's free. It's about, if you print it out, it kind of looks like this. We even have a cover page for you. And it's about 100 pages long. It's got a lot of photographs. We unearthed about 88 pages of newspaper articles. They're also included as another download. And then there's another section that you can go to where we have taken the archived materials of the association, and that include like newsletters we used to put out and scientific projects we have participated in, and we put those in another download section area. It's about 100 pages in length. And we invite you to check it out. It's kind of a fun read. It's a fun thing to take a look at. So if you're looking for resources on how to know more about the night sky, telescopes, astrophotography, and beyond, who are you going to call? And if you want a short, interesting read about the growth and development of a small group of people in our Black Hills community who have adopted new technologies and taken on challenges to explore the universe and share their passion with the night of the night sky with the community, then you can download the history for free. We've been doing this now for nearly 70 years. That's the link. That's a little star party. I think we held it 2 years ago, 3 years ago. 19. And what we did is everybody brought their telescopes, so there, you can just go around and see what it's like to look in a different telescope. The Astronomical Society meets monthly at the School of Mines, and then once a month as well at Culver's on the west side. The meetings at the School of Mines are business meetings, and we also have a presentation on some astronomy topic, and they're always interesting. They're always interesting. Usually the program happens first, so you can skip the business meetings. And then at Culver's, those are the ones I like because really they are conversations. It's people sitting around having dinner and they talk about all things. And so what happens is that this last month, Richard was talking about he's working with this new program, Nina, that he will set up in the early evening, and then it runs itself at night, going to different targets, catching pictures, saving those, and going to another target and capturing pictures, and he doesn't even have to be there. It's amazing. We have a website, we have a website, it's SD, like South Dakota, BHAS, Black Hills Astronomical Society.org. And then it has all kinds of interesting things there and information. And if you're interested in becoming a member, you can get it right there or talk to somebody here tonight. We have an observatory close to Rapid City, and it's with an observatory grade telescope. And I really hope you can get a chance to come out for one of our star parties this summer to take a look at this thing. It's amazing. We have public and private star parties in the summertime. For members, we hold dark sky star parties at locations within about an hour of town. We also do overnight star parties. This last summer, we went up to Slim Buttes. It's one of the last dark sky spots in South Dakota. And when the Milky Way comes out, I mean, it's different in a dark sky spot. Those stars jump out of the sky. We also got some Aurelia Borealis up there that night. And I think Kip, or whose eyes were turned green.
It was red.
Very cool. Okay, let's not talk about that. Also, we have been setting up telescopes out at the Badlands Astronomy Festival. This is my last picture for you. This was taken last Friday night or Friday morning. I got up around 2 o'clock. There's a new comet out there. It is C2022 E3 ZTF. Sorry, I didn't memorize it. It's up right now, and it was about a half a moon, and so I couldn't really see the tail on it. And so I think that this Thursday morning, it's supposed to be clear again. Hopefully I can get out there and catch it. I had heard about this new comet, and it was in the sky, and I wanted to see it for myself. Through resources that the BHAS membership have given me, I was able to locate it and snap this 2-minute picture. I read that the comet came by here about 50,000 years ago. I can't believe that they could estimate that. Or maybe some of our distant relatives might have looked up and seen it. It's interesting to think that by looking at it, I might be sharing an experience that they had. If you have an interest in the night sky, I'd invite you to explore the interest further. I can tell you from personal experience that BHAS can be an invaluable resource to you. I'd like to thank Ron Dyvig, whose history covering 1954 to 1958 was our inspiration for working on the history project. I'd like to thank Richard Walker, who jumped in and really helped complete the history, and the members, past and present, who made contributions to the project and helped me on my journey to become an amateur astronomer. So thank you for coming this evening. But before I quit, I got to thinking that I wanted to mention one other resource in the area for you that you may or may not be aware of. And that is the Badlands Observatory. It's where you do solar viewing during the day and have access to a number of telescopes for night viewing. It's where the largest telescope in South Dakota can be found. It's a giant. I tell you, it's a giant. Where you can browse an interesting astronomy museum where they have incredible astrophotography photos that they've taken, and you can see a 10-foot diameter radio telescope in action. They really got the real deal out there. Badlands Observatory is open for business in Quinn. Quinn's like an hour east. What you do is you go to Wall and then turn like you're going to the pier. In about 5 miles, you're there. Ron and Teresa are great hosts. They're very knowledgeable, provide a great experience. So I suggest you check them out. And if you'd like to, Ron is here tonight. Ron, raise your hand. There he is. I think he's got some brochures there, I hope.
Yeah, I have a few handouts.
Okay. And if you haven't been there, schedule an appointment. I mean, this is, Ron has 25 asteroids that he has discovered. The South Dakota asteroid is, he named it. He's been involved in the organization since, I think, 1958. And he's a great resource. So check out that. Check out the Black Hills Astronomical Society. And are there any questions? Yes.
Thursday morning, what direction do I look?
It's in the east northeast. And I think it's up probably about 25 degrees. Am I pretty close on that, gentlemen?
At about 3 in the morning.
About 3 in the morning, yeah. They say that you can see it with the naked eye. I think you'd want to have binoculars. Okay. Any other question? Yes. Star parties, they begin probably in late May and go through September. Okay, it's whenever it gets warm enough, you know, where there's not snow on the ground. And you go to our website and that's where you find out. Okay, and the thing is that we schedule them and then, you know, weather happens. And so then we post it on the website. Is that correct, guys? Okay, we post it on the website and that's where you keep involved. The public star parties are free. Okay, if you make a donation, we like it. The private star parties, if you have like a family group or your scout group or some group that you'd like to bring out for them, what you want to, we have a fee schedule for that. It's not very expensive, but there's information about that too on the website. And we can, then we'll take a look at who's available and then we'll figure out a date and make that happen. Yeah.
We're making a trip to Hawaii later this month, and I've heard that there's a world-class observatory somewhere on one of the islands of Hawaii. Is that for the public, or should we?
I don't know. Has anybody ever been to Hawaii?
Yes, it's on the big island.
Bet we can find out. That's the right island, so that's where we're going. Look it up.
Look it up and see if they do. There's a lot of observatories where we can visit them. You know, down in Flagstaff, isn't that Lowell Observatory? They have a great program. And a lot of those older observatories, you know, that aren't state of the art, they have become educational facilities. And so they really provide a great program. Maybe better than the state of the art. Yes.
What's one of your favorite views or experiences that you've had with your astronomy experience? Something that stands out the most.
One of the pictures that was on there, it's a horrible picture. Okay. It was a lot of, the sky wasn't right. And it quintet. And I looked it up because one of the first pictures that the James Webb Telescope was that Stephen's quintet object. And it had all those, you know, the light, you know, the galaxies that were all bent out of shape and stuff. And I found it. I also have one that I've taken that is it just looks like there's a little group of stars. But one of them is like 2.5 billion light years away. That's as far as I've been able to see, okay, into the past. And so, you know, I love the big nebula ones, you know, Orion. I mean, that's just a killer right now. Flame nebula and the Horsehead, you know, those are just great things to capture. But at those really distant ones are the really weird ones. It's kind of like, even if they're just a little step. Yeah.
So one of the slides that cycled through was, I noticed, from your Slim strip.
Yeah.
So can we access those slides, your photos, other photos at the BHAS site, or where to go?
As a matter of fact, every month I put out a blog and I post not every one, but all the good pictures that I take during that month. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 pictures. Sometimes it's a couple of dozen pictures. And those are all available on the Astronomy Society website. And you just go to, I think it's BHAS, and you go to member blogs, and you just find Hank. And I've got 2 years worth of photos there. And so there's a lot of material there. And lately I've been putting little explanations about things so that becomes a little more apparent when I'm looking at it. My big discovery this month, I was looking at the moon. I love looking. It's easy to spot, okay? But there were 3 craters that were just like boom, 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 all about the same size, and they're just in a row. And so I don't know if you have a moon atlas, and I looked them up. They're all named after a Henry. Okay, I'm a Henry. It doesn't take much to excite me, okay? Yes.
You had a picture early on in the talk when you were talking about the history of the club back in the 1950s.
Yeah.
That they were originally going to build an observatory there by the School of Mines. That picture from the newspaper article looks strikingly like what's now the weather building where they launch weather balloons from. Was that built initially? Was that the building that they were thinking of building?
They never built anything.
Well, they didn't.
No, they never raised the money to do it. The legislature just said, this is a good spot of land for it. And I think it was on that little hillside. Yeah.
A lot of people think it's an observatory because it's got that
Yeah.
round dome on it. Where they launch the other thing.
School of Mines should build one. Anything else? Well, I hope to see you out at HVO this summer. Have a good time. And if you join the organization, I tell you, there's nothing like going out to a dark sky site, being out there staking around in the weeds, It's fun. It's fun. Thank you so much.